Hello, my name is Christopher Scott from the Biblical Leadership blog at christopherscottblog.com, and today I'm going to provide a brief introduction to the book of Philippians. So as I normally like to do, I like to teach through books of the Bible and start by going, pretty much verse by verse and walking through books of the Bible, looking through about their main things that they're trying to teach, the author's trying to teach, as well as looking at some of the leadership applications that we can make for people who lead organizations. But before I want to do that for Philippians, I want to provide just a brief introduction to the book and a brief overview of some of the things that Paul talks about in Philippians, who wrote the book, why he wrote the book, some basic things like that. So the first thing I think is good to look at is the authorship of the book of Philippians. So the book of Philippians is written by Paul, who wrote many of the other New Testament letters. So we see this from Philippians 1:1, where Paul writes, as I have the text here, I read from the New Living Translation most of the time. Paul writes, "This letter is from Paul and Timothy, slaves of Jesus Christ. I'm writing to all of God's holy people in Philippi who belong to Christ Jesus, including the elders and deacons." So this introduction that Paul writes here is very similar to several of his other introductions that he writes in his other letters. So the beginning of Paul's letter to Philippians is very similar to Colossians, Ephesians, Galatians, 1st and 2nd Timothy, where Paul starts, Paul, an apostle. All right, so he starts out in those other ways. In Titus, he starts out a little bit different. He says, Paul, a servant. And then in Philemon, he starts out, Paul, a prisoner. So in all these letters that Paul has written, he starts out pretty much in the same way, and so he does as well here in Philippians. So it's no surprise in his introduction. The letter also reveals that Paul was in the midst of suffering when writing this letter that he talks about primarily in the 1st chapter and the 4th chapter. Most likely, Paul wrote this letter while imprisoned in Rome, somewhere between 60 and 63 AD, that we read about in the book of Acts. Acts chapter 28 talks about Paul's journey to Rome and how that all happened. So the author of the book of Philippians is Paul, who wrote from Rome while in prison to the people living in Philippi. So now that we've talked about the author, it's good to look also at the audience as far as who would be receiving this letter. And the recipients of this letter obviously are the people living in Philippi at that time. So in that first verse, Paul says, this letter is from Paul and Timothy, slaves of Jesus Christ. I'm writing to all of God's holy people in Philippi who belong to Jesus Christ. And so Paul's interaction with the people in Philippi and relationship with them started in the book of Acts chapter 16, where Paul is traveling with Luke, and they're traveling around Macedonia. And they come to this city called Philippi. And Paul walks out, goes outside the city to this water area, this river area, and he meets some women out there, and he starts to share the gospel and preach the gospel to these women there. And in that sharing of the gospel, he meets a woman named Lydia, and she accepts the gospel, believes in Jesus Christ, and invites Paul and his companions to her home, in which Paul does go to her home, and they stay with her. And then Paul gets to share the gospel with the people living in her home and staying in her home. And that likely is the beginning of the church in Philippi. To those women who are out near the river on the Sabbath day that Paul first shared the gospel with, and then starting with the woman named Lydia. And after Paul meets Lydia and shares the gospel with her, he heals a demon-possessed girl, which gets him in a little bit of trouble in Philippi. So the people in Philippi, the leaders, throw him in prison. He gets beaten up in prison, then he gets let out. Paul returns back to Lydia's house, talks with her a little bit, gives her and her companions some encouragement, and then he goes off and continues his missionary journey. And then after that, Paul gets to do another missionary journey in which he travels back up through Macedonia, and likely made another visit to the people of Philippi there. So Paul had started his relationship with the Philippians in Acts chapter 16, and then in his latter missionary journey, he likely got to go back and see them again, even though the book of Acts isn't as explicit in that second time he visited there, but likely did go back through there. And then when looking at the city of Philippi, it was a pretty old city. It was built in 358 BC. By Philip of Macedon, And most of the people living there were veterans of Antonin's army, according to some articles that I've read. The city was old and historic. It was along the main overland route that connected Rome and the East area. After having been destroyed by wars, it was rebuilt by Emperor Octavian. And I'm reading some of this history because I want to make sure I get it correct and not just make up stuff as I go. But this is actual historical material here. So after the city of Philippi had been destroyed by wars, it was rebuilt by Emperor Octavian and was established as a military outpost and populated by veterans of Octavian's wars. It was a Roman colony, and it was given the title of what's called Ius Italiacum, which was one of the highest privileges attainable by a provincial municipality. So it was this city where there were a lot of veterans of the military that stayed there. Philippi was in the area of Macedonia, but it was a Roman colony, and because of that, the people were proud to be Romans. They were proud to be called Romans, they were proud to be Roman citizens, they were proud to follow the Roman laws, all of those good things, according to them, good things. So that's the author and the audience that Paul wrote this letter to. The occasion that Paul might have written this letter, or why he might have written this letter, were for two reasons. One, there were people who were preaching out of jealousy and rivalry, and Paul might be answering the questions of believers regarding those men or women who are preaching out of jealousy or rivalry. So that might be the first reason that he writes this letter. A second reason is to solve some of the disagreements that might have been occurring in the Philippian church that we read about primarily in chapter 3 and in chapter 4. So that's the occasion that Paul wrote this letter, maybe to answer the questions that the people in Philippi had about people preaching out of jealousy and rivalry, or the disagreements that were occurring in the city of Philippi, among believers. I referenced earlier the date written is usually good to look at. It likely was written between 60 and 63 AD while Paul was in prison in Rome. It was under Nero, most likely. The key verse to the book, I would say, is Philippians chapter 1, verse 27. This is the key verse, in my opinion. Paul writes, "Above all, you must live as citizens of heaven, conducting yourselves in a manner worthy of the good news about Christ. Then, whether I come to see you again or only hear about you, I will know that you are standing together with one spirit and one purpose, fighting together for the faith which is the good news." So the first time I taught through this book, I actually chose a different verse, but I really think this is the summary verse of the entire book, that Paul wants these Philippian believers to live as citizens of heaven. Just as they are living in Philippi as citizens of Rome, he wants them to live in Philippi just as they are citizens of heaven, and to conduct themselves in a manner worthy of the good news. Pretty much I think that's the key verse of the book. So we've talked about the occasion of the letter, we talked about the author, the audience, the date written, the key verse. The primary message of the book of Philippians, in my opinion, is that believers ought to live righteously based on the example of Christ, by enduring suffering, by living in harmony with each other, and focusing on the righteousness they all have, is the primary message, I believe, of the book. There's some theological themes in the book. The first is the work and result of Christ, or Christ and his work and result, and what that means for believers. Sanctification is another theme. Paul's suffering, and then Paul's imprisonment, and then suffering because of ministry are the other themes that I think really get talked about in good detail. And if you're curious for more details on these four areas, I have a blog post that I will link to, where I go through pretty much verse by verse in Philippians, and I show where each of these themes shows up and why I believe those themes are important. So that's a brief introduction to the book of Philippians, that the book was written by Paul, written to the people living in Philippi, a Roman colony in the area of Macedonia. It was written because the occasion was because there was people preaching out of jealousy and rivalry, as well as there were some disagreements in the church. The book was written in AD 60 to 63, while Paul was imprisoned in Rome. The key verse is Philippians 1:27. The message is that believers ought to live righteously based on the example of Christ by living in harmony with each other, enduring suffering, and focusing on the righteousness they all have. Some of the theological themes that we talked about is that the book of Philippians looks at Christ's and his work and result, sanctification, Paul's imprisonment, and suffering because of ministry. I almost forget the fourth one. So this has been a brief introduction to the book of Philippians. It's a great book. It's a short book, only 4 chapters, so it's easy to study. In the following videos, I'll be sharing some leadership principles from the book and teaching through the book verse by verse. If you want to learn more about the Bible and leadership, you can visit my blog at christopherscottblog.com, where I regularly share blog posts about the Bible and leadership and what leaders can do to lead in a biblical way. So thanks for tuning in. My name is Christopher Scott, and I hope to get to talk to you again soon.